Hello, everyone. Welcome to America Adapts, the climate change podcast. Welcome to the premiere episode of America Adapts. This podcast is about climate change, but more specifically, how America is going to adapt to climate change. We'll talk to scientists, planners, policymakers, or anyone who has interest in adaptation. And we also hope to have a little fun along the way. On today's podcast, we're talking to Nick Fisichelli about national parks, adaptation versus resilience, how one might communicate adaptation, and we're briefly going to talk with Tim Watkins in our Adaptation Roundtable. If you want to learn more about the podcast today, please check out our website, americaadapts.org, or visit the Facebook page, America Adapts. Okay, I hope you enjoy the podcast. Welcome again, everyone. This is Doug Parsons with America Adapts. I'm very excited that our first guest is Dr. Nick Fisichelli, and I am pronouncing his name right, I think. Is that right, Nick?
You got it, Doug.
Okay, excellent. I've known Nick for a few years now, and I think all this time I probably have said his last name 2 or 3 times, and so I don't end up pronouncing it very often. So welcome, Nick. Where are you at right now, just so our listeners can get a sense of where you're at?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me on, Doug. Well, I am in Maine on the tip of the Schoodic Peninsula, which juts out into the Atlantic Ocean. It's part of Acadia National Park, and I'm at Schoodic Institute, which is a nonprofit organization here that focuses on research and education for all ages.
So just so folks know, Nick and I, we used to work together at the National Park Service, and these are some of the things that we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about all things climate change, adaptation, some of the things going on with the National Park Service. I'd like to talk a bit about scenario planning because Nick is an expert in that area, and I think it's one of those things that people just aren't really quite sure what it means. And so those are some of the things that I want to talk about. But, before we get started, again, a little bit more background with you, Nick. I'd like to share some personal info on people, too. And so it's my understanding after talking to one of your colleagues is that you hate flowers and butterflies and all that is good with the world. Now, is that an accurate sort of assessment of what this feedback I got from some colleagues?
Oh my, I have to wonder who you were talking to.
It's anonymous, but
right. Yes. Maybe that depends on the day.
Okay.
I would say I'm very partial to plants. So I'm a forest ecologist is my background, and so trees especially. I have a fondness for trees.
Okay, so that might be a generalization, but I thought that was pretty striking that butterflies. I mean, who doesn't like butterflies? But you're coming from Colorado and you've moved to Maine, and the more kind of the winter in Maine is going to be pretty harsh, but it sounds like that it might be right up your alley.
Yeah, absolutely. I grew up in the Northeast, and so I'm looking forward to the winters up here. They're not too bad in Colorado either, especially if you get up into the mountains. It's good to get out and enjoy the snow.
Well, I'm based here in Washington, D.C., and I tell you what, these winters kill me, and people mock me because they think that D.C. has a pretty mild winter. And, when you're originally from Florida, D.C. might as well be the Siberia. I can't even imagine what Maine's going to be like. So I'm glad you're going to enjoy it.
So you have a different baseline there. And so it just feels a lot worse if you're coming from Florida.
Yeah, and you just never get used to it, these 6-7 month long winters. So, yeah. Well, so Nick, I guess a little bit more about your background. So prior to, you're really new at the Schoodic Institute. You've been there for like a month or two, right?
That's right. Yes, I just started last month at the Institute, and so I'm the director of the Forest Ecology program here, which is a brand new program, and we're focused on science education and stewardship outreach, and so trying to understand forest dynamics in this region. How are these forests changing? What are the important environmental drivers behind those changes? And trying to incorporate citizen science into that research. So getting folks out there to help with documenting changes in phenology and forest composition and educating and school kids and getting them interested and excited in science and in conservation. And then finally thinking about stewardship outreach. So working with managers, whether they're park managers for local land trusts, others in the region to think about climate change and to adapt to changing conditions.
So how big is Skudik Institute? I mean, like how many people work there?
It's pretty small. It's a small institute. It's there's depending on, certainly there's some more folks here in the summertime, but about 15 people. So it's a pretty small shop. It's also a conference center. So there are various conservation groups can come here and other groups to have staff meetings and their conferences.
So I'm assuming if anyone wants to learn more about it, they can go online. There's a website that they could visit.
Exactly. Yes. SchooDicInstitute.org.
And I'll spell it out. It's in front of me. SchooDic. It's a little bit kind of hard to figure out. So
Skudik right.
Institute. So yeah, check it out. I've dug around on the site a bit, especially when I heard you got this position. So again, congratulations on the new role there. So
thank you.
Well, I thought we'd jump right in. The topic of this podcast really is climate change adaptation. And since you are an expert and I want experts coming on to talk about this issue, the issue of adaptation is one I think that, we're still figuring out how we're communicating this to the public. And so here's a question I want to ask you is that, you're married, right? You've been married for a while?
Yes.
So I don't know if you're friendly with your mother-in-law, but do you feel like your mother-in-law has any clue what you do for a living?
No.
Okay.
I don't think so.
So if she was talking to some friends and she was describing what her son-in-law does, she might get that you're in the environmental field.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
I think that might be as far as it goes.
Yeah. You could probably say that maybe, do you think your wife, she might be able to explain it?
I would, I would hope so. I may have to quiz her on that. But it's, it's true. Like you said, it's hard to explain adaptation. And I think we're just figuring out what is it? What does it mean? What does it look like? It's rapidly evolving. So we're figuring it out as we go.
Yeah, I think part of it is that everyone's sort of coming to terms that, well, not everyone, but climate change is happening. What's it going to mean for the future? And so the idea that you're pivoting to okay, now we're going to actually adapt to these changes, that's still, I think we have a long ways to go, especially with the public. So that's part of our challenge.
I think so. And early on in the response to climate change, it was really focused on mitigation. So reducing greenhouse gases and through lower emissions and then also greater sequestration of carbon. And that was the focus of the climate change response. And adaptation came on sort of a little bit later. And at first was a bit of a sort of a dirty word that we were giving up on the environment by adapting to these changes rather than just trying to fight and mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. But there's the realization that change is really sort of baked into the system, that there's a lot of these long lag times between when emissions happen and when the climate system and the earth system responds to them. So we have to continue to respond to these changes and recognize that climate change is ongoing and that it's not just a 2050 or 2100 issue, but that it's happening now. And so we have to be adjusting to the changes as well as trying to mitigate future climate change.
Well, that's been an interesting part of adaptation. It's a relatively new field. It's even newer than, climate change mitigation. And, when Al Gore's movie, An Inconvenient Truth, came out, there was all this controversy of when people start talking about adaptation, they're like, you can't talk about that. That means you've given up on mitigating climate change. And I always thought that was a curious thing. It's no, that's not what we're saying at all.
Right. Exactly. I think, that's very true. And you realize that we need both of these strategies. We need to adjust to ongoing changes and we need to try to mitigate future impacts, future changes. And we need both together. And mitigation, in a lot of ways is I think of it as it's becoming more and more important because the adaptation that we're trying to enact now is not going to be successful in the future under a high emissions greenhouse gas scenario. That we're only going to be effective at adapting to changes if we can really minimize the amount of climate change through mitigation.
Well, we'll get into it a little bit more with some of the scenario planning that I want to talk about a little bit later. But, I always struggle with like coming up with a proper analogy of what adaptation planning is, because this concept of uncertainty. And so I thought I came up with a semi-decent one. It's sort of like you're planning to have a dinner party. And it's like you're not quite sure if you're inviting maybe 5 to 10 people over for a nice little dinner party. And so what do you need to do to get ready for that dinner party? Maybe get a little extra food, clean up the house a little bit, but you don't really have to worry about anything. Or are you expecting 500 college students to come to your house? And how would you prepare your house differently than that 5 to 10 person party? And so I kind of like that concept because, there's these extremes. And like, I think us involved with the adaptation universe, I think we're sort of not committed to that 500 person party type of thinking yet. So, I mean, what do you think?
That's interesting. Yeah, you got to think about their dietary restrictions too. And if they have to all take their shoes off coming into that house, there's a lot of those details there. That's an interesting analogy.
Well, you got your grandmother's ashes in the urn, and so when the 5 people come over, you just leave that out. But like 500 people come in the door, you might go lock that up,
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, but to the point of like, don't you think looking at some of the scenario planning, it's like, are we really thinking like some of those extreme kind of scenarios? And so, I mean, I want to jump into that in a little bit, but it's just, I wanted to start off to kind of thinking of like, what is adaptation planning? So.
Right. Yeah. And, there's always those surprises and you never know. It's hard to recognize some of those beforehand. And whether it's going to be that 5 or that 500. And, there's certain things you can expect and that we can plan for, and other parts that are just going to be some surprises that we have to sort of have on the radar, but without knowing for sure how many people are going to show up.
Right. So I guess, is this a 3 kegger climate change impact, or is it just a bottle of wine climate change? So.
Yes. So you have to have a well-stocked pantry and a really big freezer and a supply of beer and wine, apparently.
Yeah, you'll need the booze for sure, I think. Well, okay. Well, I struggle with analogies, and I think, everyone struggles. Like, what is your adaptation elevator speech as you try to explain this issue to more people? And I don't think any of our in-laws or even our parents are going to ever be able to really figure out what we do, but maybe there'll be a little bit of progress.
Hopefully, maybe this podcast will help.
All right. So you get your mother-in-law to listen to this, please.
Yes. If only she knew what a podcast was.
Maybe when you're driving with her in the car, you could just stick it on and she's forced to listen to it. So what's her first name?
Norma,
we're counting on you to listen to this, okay? If you end up listening to this, we're putting a plug into you, Norma, so you'll understand what your son-in-law does. He's doing great work. So, Nick, I want to pivot over to, we know each other from our time together at the National Park Service in the Climate Change Response Program. It's been a few years since I've been in that, and you're more recently removed. And so I always thought it was pretty progressive that, the Park Service had such a program. And, for all its warts and, what might you do differently compared to, I think, a lot of federal agencies, they were doing some interesting things. And I'd sort of like to talk about that and kind of get your perspective. And now that you're not working for NPS, not that I'm here wanting to bash the National Park Service, but have a conversation like, what are some of the things that they're doing right? What should they be doing differently? And so that's what I would sort of like to talk about. You want to give a little bit of background what you did with the Park Service?
Sure. So I like you, worked for the Climate Change Response Program, and I was an adaptation ecologist. So essentially helping parks and the Park Service understand ongoing and future climate change and effects to management and to resources, and thinking about ways to adapt to those changes. And we had the mantra that climate change affects all aspects of park management. So natural and cultural resource protection, operations and facilities, infrastructure, as well as the visitor use and experience. And that makes one of the reasons why climate change is a challenge, is that it's complex and has these far-reaching effects on all aspects of management.
And just so folks kind of have a little bit more context, so the national park system, I think they're up to 410 park units. Does that sound right?
Yeah, 410 or 411. Yes.
Seems like
so it's a huge number, exactly, and it stretches from Guam in American Samoa out in the South Pacific to Hawaii, to Alaska, the lower 48, and there are even sites in the Caribbean, in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. So it's a huge swath of the globe when you think about it. It crosses the equator, so from south of the equator to basically to the Arctic Circle, and across something like 11 time zones, I believe.
And let's not forget to give a plug to cultural resources. People think national parks, they think Yosemite, they think Yellowstone, but, all these cultural resources, then they might just be small parks or they might be battlefields. And so those too are, having to be considered when you think about climate change. And so the Park Service has a huge mandate. And I mean, you're aware of all that.
But yeah, that's a great point. There are 411 units. There's all sorts of different types. There are national parks, big national parks in the West with these large undeveloped wilderness areas. And then you have monuments, you have seashores, lake shores. Then you have battlefields and historic sites. And there are parks in urban areas. That the National Mall. Those are National Park Service sites, the Lincoln Memorial, the Jefferson Memorial, the Vietnam War Memorial, all sorts of different sites. So it's that makes it a management a challenge too, that you're not just dealing with one type of park, but a huge variety of parks that, again, like you said, they are protecting not only our natural heritage, but our cultural heritage as well.
I worked in the DC office, and we like to joke there was a tiny little 20-foot by 20-foot piece of grass that technically the National Park Service was in charge of. And so we would go spend our time out in the country's national parks for lunch. And so really quickly, do you have a favorite national?
Ooh, a favorite one. I think I do. I would say it's Marsh Billings Rockefeller, which is in Vermont, and it's it's one of these tiny parks. It's about 500 acres, and not very many people have heard of it. And it's a great park because it has that blend of both natural and cultural resources, and so it has these beautiful forests, these northern hardwood forests in the park, which are in one sense a natural resource, but they're also sort of really the fundamental cultural resource of the park, in that they're one of the oldest planned and managed reforestation efforts in the United States. So one of the first efforts at really modern silviculture back in the mid 1800s, and so it was originally owned by George Perkins Marsh, and then eventually transferred ownership to Frederick Billings, who really focused on the forest there. And he went over to France and Germany and in the 1800s and studied some of the at the time state-of-the-art forest management and silviculture that was being developed. And he brought that to North America and tried to try his hand at some sustainable forest management, which was something really new at the time in the 1800s. We were still sort of cutting our way across the country. It was the era of Paul Bunyan, and it seemed like forests were limitless. And but some realized that we needed some smart management of forests, and so this park, Marsh Billings Rockefeller, it tells the story of that evolving forest stewardship. And so to me, it's a great place. And now today, it's even that continuing to tell the story of evolving forest stewardship, because that park is thinking about climate change and how they can adapt their management to changing conditions so that they continue to foster healthy forests in that park into the future, and can continue to tell that living story of forest stewardship in America.
Wow. I thought you were going to say something like Yellowstone, and we're going to end it there. You have put a lot of thought into your favorite national park. That's a great story. I'd never even heard of that. That's fantastic. So
yes.
I learned something about a park. When you work at the Park Service, I tried on a regular basis to kind of go through the parks and just learn a little bit, but I probably got to like 111 before I left. And so, yeah, there's a lot of parks there. That's great.
There are, yes.
I was just going to say either Rocky Mountain National Park or the Everglades, and
right.
mainly the Everglades because it's got a great story. There's a great book called The Swamp that talks about the development of the Everglades, and like the Everglades kept fighting back against development until like I think it was about the 1930s until the Army Corps finally tamed it. But before then, they just kept. I mean, the area just anytime there was any development, they kept like I'm not saying they, but the park itself, it's a great story, and you're rooting for the Everglades until finally they lost the Army Corps. So
gotcha. I have not been there. There are so many parks I would like to visit. You got to get one of those passport books and get a stamp at each park that you visit.
Yeah, I think I've seen like 6 parks. I got a long way to go. So, back to the climate change program with the parks. And so again, there's all these park systems. And so what you were sort of getting to is that we worked in a service-wide program. And what that means is we weren't associated with any one park, but we were there as a resource to all these parks. And so each of these parks has a superintendent, or most do. And there's actually quite a bit of autonomy with each of the parks. And so each park can kind of approach some of these topics in different ways. And so there's guidance coming from the national office, but it's not like they have to do what you say. And so in some ways that's a good thing, but in other ways that's a bad thing, especially if some of the parks that should be doing more on climate change aren't. I mean, what are your thoughts on that kind of like the service-wide approach to climate change planning?
Right. I think that's true. The role that we played there was really in a support office. So providing some expertise, scientific expertise, guidance on decision-making approaches, but we weren't in the chain of command, so to speak, in the Park Service. So I didn't get to tell parks what to do. They're the others that fill that role or wear that hat. And as you mentioned, there's a lot of autonomy among the parks, and so some like to describe it as sort of a bottom-up organization, that you have these lots of these individual parks that sort of are managing themselves, and there's not as much directive coming from above. And so for dealing with something like climate change and trying to bring in something that's really brand new, that parks haven't been engaged in, it's more challenging if there aren't directives from above, from the director and the regional director and others that are sort of forcing parks to immediately change course and think about climate change. And yet there are really some great managers at parks, and they're the ones who are recognizing that change is happening. They're seeing effects to resources in their parks and are recognizing that some of these changes have to happen. But because it's really happening on a sort of at the park level, some managers are much more engaged than others in the response already.
Yeah, and I don't think a lot of people appreciate that there's a kind of a tiered level to the parks. You have like the big kids on the block, the LeBron James, and that's like Yosemite and Yellowstone and Everglades, and like there's these tier 1 parks, and so the superintendents are actually quite influential. And so even things that are being directed from DC, it's not like you want to counter what the director of the Park Service is saying, but like there's some dynamics there that these big parks have a lot of leeway in what they can do. And so I mean it could be a challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. And some have like you said, they have a much higher profile. So what happens in the parks is sometimes there's more under the magnifying glass than a small park. I mentioned Marsh Billings Rockefeller. You hadn't heard of it before. Many people have not. It's not quite of the same profile as an Acadia or a Yellowstone or Yosemite.
So, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so, you worked with the parks on some of these planning issues more so than I did. And, can you give us like 1 or 2 examples of some of the parks that are doing some really cool things out there?
Yeah, well, I mentioned the Marsh Billings Rockefeller, and the reason I even heard of that park is because that was one of the parks that submitted a request for some climate change adaptation assistance, and so that's where we worked with that park to think about their forest management and how they may be able to just alter some of their ongoing management practices, the silvicultural prescriptions that they're applying on the landscape, just so that they're fostering tree species that are adapted to current and future conditions. Another one, and I think another small park that probably is not well known, it's called Knife River Indian Villages, and this is in central North Dakota, and it's this really fascinating place. Tells the story of the Native Americans that lived in that region, and the villages that they lived in there right along the river, and there's a lot of archaeological sites in this location, and it was the Mandan and the Hidatsa Indians in this location, and so they live right along this river, and that's where their villages were, and so now it's a park with these tremendous archaeological sites within it right along the river, and this is the Knife River is fairly small, so it doesn't have a dam on it, so it's a free flowing dynamic river that includes erosion of some river banks and sedimentation in other areas. And so the park is dealing with heavier rainfall events and some acceleration of riverbank erosion that's going to take away some of the archaeological resources just through erosion and then a loss in flooding events. And so the park's trying to figure out how to adapt to these changes. And what's a challenge here, that the free-flowing river is itself a resource and value there, that you have this dynamic river system, and the cottonwood forests along the river require that dynamic nature of the river in order to regenerate and to establish cottonwood seedlings on new sediments that get deposited after floods. And so there's a sort of a push and pull between cultural resource preservation and fostering just the natural dynamics of a river system within this park. And so the park's really in the process of figuring out how to really find that balance there, that they can identify and preserve key resources, both natural and cultural under climate change.
So do you have a sense if they're able to kind of communicate the broader issue of climate change at the park? It's a somewhat conservative area, at least the areas around it.
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say it's still developing there in their management plan. They have a draft management plan that they're putting together. So they're still working through the process.
Okay, and so you would just help support staff that are drafting up these management plans and such.
That's right, exactly, yes. And that is an example where we did do some scenario planning with that park to think about what the future may look like.
All right, well, I learned 2 new parks today, and they're doing some great adaptation planning. That's fabulous. I'm just so used to the bigger parks, which I was going to ask my next question. So the Everglades, I have a bias toward the Everglades because I'm from Florida. And so did you ever work with Everglades National Park on adaptation planning? I mean, they have a huge staff, and some of the folks down there probably are versed in this, but did you end up working with them at all?
I have not. I didn't really get a chance to work with many parks in Florida.
That's all right. You won't hold it against you.
But yeah, for a big park, I mean, one example is here at Acadia that I had a chance when I still worked with NPS to work with Acadia. And I continue to work with the managers now on climate adaptation. And this is an example of a park with some real champions in the resource management division here that are forward thinking and they recognize climate change as an issue and they're trying to respond to it and to try to really take some of these newly developed adaptation tools for a spin and to try to use them to inform their planning and management.
Well, what I think makes the Everglades so interesting, and, I think the previous superintendent there, I think it was Dan Kimball. Does that sound right?
I think so.
He's recently retired, but, they were talking a lot of really good things about climate change in the Everglades. But to me, there's this sort of this unspoken thing, and you probably feel the same way about some other other parks is that, if you even look at some of the kind of middle of the road models for sea level rise, that the Everglades is basically going to be an extension of like Biscayne National Park. It's going to be a marine park. And yet, even though Everglades talks a lot about climate change, they just tiptoe around that. And it's, for folks that are in the planning world, it's like, that's almost a sure thing. And so it's probably really tough for the parks to have those kind of like sober conversations, especially with people visiting the parks.
Yeah, those are really big challenges, and a lot of those low-lying parks along the coast. Those are big questions. What are those areas going to look like in the future, and what's the conservation value of those areas, and how do you deal with those changes, and how much do you influence the changes and direct the changes or try to resist them? Those are those really, really big questions. Those big, that's the big meaty question with adaptation, is that we can't just look to the past to guide us in our management, and that idea of using past conditions as sort of your target for what the landscape should look like. We've recognized that even in the past, conditions were very dynamic, although there was often the thought of sort of a dynamism around sort of a stable baseline. And now we recognize that climate change is directional change, and we're seeing just continuous directional change. And so it's hard to know what we're managing for, and how do we know if we're being effective, or how do managers know if they're being effective when conditions are changing, and they can't just base their management on what was found in a park in the past.
Most of everything you just said made sense to me, most of it, but
I'm surprised.
Oh, checkmate. But what was occurring to me as you were saying those things, I'm like, check, right. And then it's just like, but explaining these sort of concepts to the public, and the public has to be part of the process of how are you going to manage these parks? That is a big ask, and I guess part of the scenario planning is you're trying to get more people closer to that. But what you just described, all these sort of things, it's just that the public doesn't get it.
Well, and it takes education, and it takes some time to bring folks up to speed on this. And the great thing about the past is that it made the decision for you, that using the past as your sort of blueprint for what you wanted your park to look like, it made all the decisions for you, and it was easy to get people on board because it was how it looked in the past. And, regardless of whether or not that was even achievable and appropriate, but it was still something that people could agree on and aim towards. And also it was the same goal basically across protected areas. And so they all had basically the same goal, was to sort of preserve the species that were found there in the past, and the conditions that were found there in the past. And now with changing conditions, we're recognizing that there is no one size fits all adaptation solution. And we can't just use the past, but we have to look at each park individually, and then even resources within each park individually, and areas within a park individually, and think about what are the desired conditions on the landscape here, and what are we going to manage toward. And that's just for managers to think, that's really hard to think about. And then you layer on that the realization that you need to bring stakeholders into that decision-making process, and that's hard as well. And it needs to be a really iterative process of this sort of co-learning and co-production of knowledge and understanding of the issues and challenges that we're all facing. And we're all facing these challenges together in climate change. We're all experiencing it. And so I think in some ways you can use these changing conditions to bring people together, to realize that we're all going to be working under these shifting conditions, some of which we understand a lot. There's also a lot of uncertainty baked in there as well, and that we need to work together to figure out how we want our parks to look in the future.
Well, one of the things I want to talk about today too is, and you are an expert in this area, kind of moving away from parks, is like this whole conversation of resilience versus adaptation. And let me give a little bit of background and why why I have such a chip on my shoulder on this is that, you know, the federal government and a lot of even the private sector, they've really embraced that word resilience. It's, and you know, if you start looking at the word, there's many definitions for it, and that's problematic, especially what are people really thinking resilience means? And I think Europe is really embracing resilience. And I get the knee-jerk embrace of the word. It's just like, we have these communities, we want to make them prepared for climate change, but it doesn't acknowledge some of these things are out of our control. And, you know, sea level rise is a big one that sort of, I think, you know, challenges the idea of resilience. And, you know, you're seeing like resilience officers all over the country. And you know, I'm glad they're investing the money in these things, but to me, they need to stick with adaptation. And it's you know, it's rhetoric, it's, you know, and semantics of these words, but I think it sends.
They're important.
Right. And so I want you, and I think you know where I'm going with this, is that you and some colleagues wrote, and I think I've got the title here, a paper addressing this issue, is Resilience Maladaptive, ? Towards an Accurate Lexicon for Climate Change Adaptation. And you know what? We need to work on that title, but it's a great paper.
Oh, come on. That's a great title.
It should just be Resilience versus Adaptation. That, boom, people get it. So... But so what were you trying to accomplish with that paper?
Next time I'll invite you to be a co-author, Doug.
You know, you won't get invited to any journals if you do that. So.
Well, so I think it's true. Resilience, it's this feel-good word. You know, I think there must be, we could do a study, and there must be some endorphins that are released in the brain when you say that word. It just sounds good. It sounds like this. Everybody wants to be resilient. We think of Rocky and you know, running up the stairs at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and you know, getting up after we get knocked down. And so it's this feel-good word that policymakers have really latched onto. And the challenge with adaptation is that we need to be working, you know, across jurisdictions with multiple stakeholders, and that have different backgrounds, people that really generally operate in different circles, and we need these people to come together to work on adaptation, and they all bring their own, you know, ideas and concepts and understandings with them, including of what resilience even means. And you know, there's resilience has many different definitions. There's the old engineering resilience, the ecological resilience, the one that, you know, I often think about. It's really the amount of stress or disturbance an ecosystem can endure before shifting to another state. And then there's the sort of more common lay definition of resilience, which is about getting back up after getting knocked down. And then the climate change resilience has all sorts of definitions, and it's somewhat synonymous with adaptation, but it's you know, somewhat of a squishy definition, and people think it's about, oftentimes some stakeholders will think it's about, you know, keeping the past, about bouncing back after a disturbance, after a storm. And yet most of the resilience definitions are about not just resisting change, but even accommodating and directing change, especially when you get into some of the social ecological system definitions of resilience. And so it's just important that we think about the terms that we're using, and that we have everybody on board with them, and understand what we're actually talking about. And then that, you know, climate change in a lot of ways means change. It means that we can't just keep the past. And so using the word resilience, I think, gives some sort of false messaging there as well, potentially, that we're going to be able to just, you know, enact some strategies to keep things as they were in the past. And that's just not true.
Well, you know, I would attend these meetings with all these other government agencies, and most of them weren't as sophisticated, and I think they've gotten better in the last couple of years than the natural resource agencies like, you know, Department of Interior and such. And so resilience, you know, they're going to go back to their agencies, and they're getting this message from like the White House that, you know, make your facilities, everything that you do, resilient. And I think the nuance of like what is adapting, what is embracing change is completely lost. They're going to be thinking like, okay, I've got to report back to demonstrate that we built this seawall, we built these levees, and it's just, I think they're going to feel a lot of pressure that we've climate proofed everything. And as you said, that's not necessarily the best strategy for everything. I look at resilience as just a subset of adaptation planning, and, you know, people are putting it on the same playing field, I think.
Right. Exactly. And I think, yeah, we need to be more careful with that and acknowledge that we're not going to be able to keep everything that we had in the past. And I think the Park Service, there's a lot of good thinking there, specifically about that, especially when it comes to cultural resources. And a lot of cultural resources in parks, these are artifacts, paleontological resources, or historical sites that were never designed to last forever. And now with climate change, it's accelerating weathering and deterioration. So there's a recognition that we're not just going to be able to preserve everything in place as it was in the past. And I think we can learn from that in the broader realm of adaptation.
Well, it warms my heart to know we're on the same page on that resilience and adaptation issue, you know. It seems like we're a losing battle. Resilience is popping up everywhere.
It is. You know, and from more of a global perspective, you know, there are a lot of, in a lot of developing areas that the idea of resilience is actually sort of negative in the sense that people are trying to improve their livelihoods, improve their societies, improve their towns. And so just bouncing back to previous conditions isn't actually a positive. And so it's another example where resilience doesn't really work.
Well, I think that whole issue will be playing out over the next 5-10 years, and we're just sort of at the front end of all these discussions. So I guess that's a good thing. So, you know, I wanted to do a little plug on that, but what I also want to talk about, this is an area that, you know, you were doing a lot of work at the National Park Service, is scenario planning. And so folks, I don't know if you want to give a little bit better background on it. I mean, I was involved with a little bit of scenario planning when I was at the National Park Service, but it's a tool that people are using now in adaptation planning. And do you have sort of like a short explanation of what you call scenario planning?
Sure, yes. And a little bit of NPS background, that it really started around 2007, 2008, just after that round of the IPCC climate change reports came out, and the Park Service, you know, wanted to start really thinking about climate change. And it's a thorny issue, and especially at that time, it was something difficult to talk about. And so scenario planning became one way to really start grappling with the issue of climate change and try to foster some discussions about it. And really the idea behind climate change, or behind scenario planning, is that there are a lot of critical uncertainties in how the future is going to play out, and we can't predict all of these factors. And so rather than forecast planning, sort of planning for one specific future, with scenario planning, you develop multiple plausible divergent futures and think about how you would plan and manage under these different futures, and recognizing that there are critical uncertainties we'll never be able to predict in the near term or understand. And so it was really a way to get beyond limitations of our abilities to sort of look into the crystal ball and figure out exactly what the future is going to look like. And so scenario planning really works well with climate change, because there are a lot of directional changes that we're seeing and understand. Temperatures are warming. That's very, very well understood. And all the projections for temperature point in one direction, and that's for warming in the future. Whereas, for example, with precipitation, it's much more difficult to model and predict precipitation and precipitation changes in the future. And so depending where you are on the landscape, you know, if you have a whole suite of climate models, some may suggest an increase in precipitation, while others may suggest a slight decrease. And so those could be some critical uncertainties that you may need to explore through a tool such as scenario planning, to think about, okay, if it's a drier future, what does that mean for my resources? Would I change my management from what I do today? Or under a much wetter future, what does that mean for my resources? and what's effective management look like under that scenario.
The workshop that I participated in, the organizers, they're jumping up and down to try to make the point that, these scenarios are not the future. They're just, there's something to think about, and I think that's probably a big challenge as you expand this process to other folks. It's like people, again, this is about dealing with uncertainty, but they want that certainty. It's like, oh, well, this scenario is saying X, Y, Z is going to happen. So they're going back and thinking, well, it's a possibility. And the language with these workshops has always been like, no, it's just to try to get you comfortable dealing with uncertainty. And so, that to me, I don't know if it's a fault of scenario planning, but you really have to, create that base for people as they start using it.
Right, and it's a new tool that you have to. I shouldn't say it's a new tool, but it's a tool that for a lot of folks in conservation is something that they haven't used in the past, and so you have to just recognize how to use it and also its limitations, and that scenarios themselves aren't forecasts of the future, but they're just a way to explore what the future may look like through some exercises, through planning exercises, and basically asking what if questions. So what if this future presented itself? How would I respond? What would my management be under this future? Or what if that future manifest, and what would my management be? And then through looking at, say, 3 or 4 distinct and divergent futures, you can compare your management actions. Did I decide to do the same type of management under all 3 future scenarios, which in that case would be sort of a robust strategy, something you would do across a wide suite of futures? Or does your management really vary across those futures? And if so, what are the important triggers or thresholds that are going to alter your management as the future plays out?
Well, I like the idea that its value is just getting people comfortable with adaptation planning and the uncertainty, because, like a planner or, a conservation person goes to these workshops, they learn this, but then when they go back and talk to their supervisor, let's say it'd be the superintendent or some local government official, and that person is wanting, okay, so tell me, what is the scenario? All right, so we need to act accordingly. And, no, it's just one scenario. And so these people, I guess, further up the food chain are wanting more concrete information. And I think that's going to be a challenge for the scenario planning approach to go from people who are directly involved to it to people who actually want to make decisions on regulations and all that.
Mm-hmm. It is a challenge because there's this shift from just that forecast planning of assuming one future and managing towards that to recognizing that there is all this uncertainty. We need to recognize what are the consequential types of uncertainty and how do we incorporate that into our decision making. I think one great example of here at Acadia, managers went through a scenario planning workshop last October, and they then took those scenarios and shared them with the local community, with the group of land trust organizations that they work with, to say, hey, this is these are the futures that we may be facing together, and so it helped to raise the climate literacy of all these different groups, and to get them all on the same page that, there's going to be some major challenges for us in the future. Some of these we can recognize now and plan for, and others we're going to have to really think hard about and assess what the future might look like. And so the scenarios themselves became sort of that boundary object that all these different groups got to sort of focus on to work together and understand how the future might unfold.
Yeah, and in the spectrum of the scenarios, you could have some where you're going to have a 7% increase in, rain events. And, when you talk to someone in charge, they're going to give you a blank stare. They're like, well, okay, is that a bad thing. And so,
Right.
trying to explain it and make it relevant to policymakers. I mean, I think there's still a lot of work to be done there.
I think, sure, absolutely. I think there is. And you're right. What is a 2.3 degrees versus 4.2 degrees? What's the difference there? It's really hard to understand. So you have to put it in relevant, to make it more relevant. And an example, working with managers in South Dakota, including Badlands National Park, really translated that then into grassland productivity, which was specifically relevant to grazing out there. So within the park, bison, and outside the park in the national grassland, there's a lot of cattle grazing. And so instead of just talking about a 7% change in precipitation, for example, we talked about changes in grassland productivity, which are actually meaningful to managers on that landscape.
Yeah, that makes more sense. I did some scenario planning in Florida. I'm just remembering that, and sea level rise was one of the major drivers in the scenarios that they came up with. And to me, what I found, and this is a fault, and I'm hoping this is changing, because as the information just becomes more, extreme, and all the models are just kind of coming in on the higher end, like with sea level rise, they just play it safe. And I think we talked about, okay, here's a model with 12 inches, here's a model with 24 inches, here's a model with 30 inches. And then, you do hear talk of no, it's going to be 6 feet. And so if you're going in there, and I think a lot of scientists really want to play it safe, they don't want to come off as alarmist, and yet the whole scenario planning process is about thinking about even those extreme scenarios. And at least I'm hoping that's changing, and that it's happening all everywhere, local governments, whatever. And maybe that's occurring, but I just found that in those Florida models, it's just that's not helpful. We need to know if something really drastic is going to happen here, and we just weren't going through that process.
Yeah, that's a tough one where you're dealing with those additional political and social hurdles there, and you want to engage people, and yet at the same time you don't want to just downplay how much sea level could rise. So that's tough. That's really tough. I mean, there's no right answer on exactly what level of extreme you should be pushing out there. It's hard to know when you're going to just turn off people from it, but at the same time, you don't want to be underestimating the amount of change that we could be seeing in the near future. So that's a tough one to navigate.
Is it the 5-person dinner party or the 500-person keg party? It's
right.
Think about this all. So, Nick, I think we've covered a lot of ground here, and we should wrap this up. And then I think some of the things that we talked about hopefully get people a bit closer with adaptation planning. Do you have any sort of final words you want to share, like some of the stuff that you do, or just talking about the issue of adaptation? Please?
Yeah. I think there's a lot of complexity in climate change, and it's tough to fit things in sound bites. And that's one of the things that we struggle with. And that climate change often doesn't just manifest as much hotter temperatures, although we recently saw really hot temperatures in the desert Southwest. But it interacts with so many other factors, especially in ecosystems. Pests and diseases, and changes in flooding regimes and storms, and interactions among species. It influences all of those things, and so it's something that's broad and complicated, and something that we need to just keep continuing to work on. And as folks like to say, that adaptation, it's a process. It's not a product. I think Bruce Stein from the National Wildlife Federation and the main lead author on the Climate Smart Conservation Guide, they like to point that out, that climate adaptation is a process, not a product. We have to be continually going back and thinking about how conditions are changing and how we're going to respond to them. And I think we're seeing, even though sometimes it feels like we're not making traction, at least in the span of days to weeks to months, I think when we look back, even just over the last 10 years, we've done a lot. And I think we'll continue to see tremendous progress in the future.
Well, I'm very interested in communicating adaptation. I think it's just this, emerging issue that the public has no clue what's coming in the pipeline. So, maybe through this podcast, we're going to get all sorts of listeners that aren't just in the adaptation orbit. That's the goal. But I think it's our responsibility to kind of share this. I use this concept of, if you're familiar with the expression, don't jump the shark.
Yes, of course.
Right. Well, you'd be surprised. People aren't familiar with it, but it's an old episode of Happy Days with Fonzie. He jumps this pool with a shark in it on water skis. And so afterwards, people are just like, why did Fonzie just jump a shark? What does it have to do with Happy Days? And so I like to compare that with adaptation planning in the broader context of conservation planning, just because, if we're not careful, we're going to leave everybody behind, whatever, paradigm shifts or other cliches. But it's just we got to bring the public along for this. And so, these new things, these new tools, scenario planning, vulnerability assessments, we have to find ways to effectively communicate to the public. So
it's a work in progress, and we're working at it all the time, and I think getting better. And I think the climate literacy out there has improved tremendously, both among land managers as well as the public, and it's going to continue to do so. And so we're making improvements there, but hopefully the adaptation show doesn't go downhill after jumping the shark, but that we're getting better and that we're improving.
Where you'll see TV shows, everything. It'll all be adaptation,
That's right.
Well, so Nick, I hope after this journey of this conversation that you can find some room in your heart for appreciating butterflies. That was one of my goals of this podcast, so I was disturbed by that.
I don't know where you heard that, but that was false information.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yes.
Slander.
Yes, absolutely.
And so for listeners, we appreciate Nick participating in this premiere podcast for America Adapts, and we'll have additional speakers in the coming weeks. But again, Nick, thanks for taking the time and having this conversation. And so for folks, I'm going to be posting this on various sites, iTunes, and some of the things that Nick has done, some of the papers I'm going to be posting on the website that we have, America Adapts, and we do a Facebook page too, and that will be americaadapts.org. Go there and you can find some more information about Nick and the Skudik Institute. And I'll ask Nick for any additional information he thinks he wants to share, that if people want to kind of dig a little bit further, then I'll plug on there. So I'll give you the last word, Nick.
Thanks, Doug. Thanks everybody out there. Look forward to speaking with you again.
Hi, everyone. This is Doug Parsons again. I hope you enjoyed our interview with Nick Fisichelli. That was a great conversation about scenario planning in national parks, and I hope you learned a little bit about that. So we're wrapping up this week's podcast, and I wanted to introduce Tim Watkins, Dr. Tim Watkins. He's a friend of mine and an old colleague of mine, and we thought we'd just wrap up the show by talking about all sort of things adaptation. Tim, you want to introduce yourself really quickly?
Sure. Hey, Doug. It's good to be on the phone with you. Yeah, my name is Tim Watkins, and I work for the National Park Service, part of the Climate Change Response Program. And in that, I do a lot of stuff around coordinating education and science education in particular that's related to climate change and climate change communication issues. And it's pretty nice to be on kind of the cutting edge of the number one topic that's affecting a lot of our society and our economy these days. So it's a good place to be.
You mentioned cutting edge, and so I'm curious, and you're walking around on the streets, do you feel like anyone has a clue what climate change adaptation is about?
Well, that is the tricky part, isn't it? Probably not as much as I think that they really should, but I bet that if you started asking people about climate change adaptation, it would occur to them in their everyday vernacular language and their thinking a lot more than we might think. Because I think basically we all kind of walk around thinking about how to make our lives better or how to solve the problems that we see around us or that we experience. And if you just start talking to people about things like, what are you going to do about, increased rainfall or rising oceans or these heat waves that are coming more and more often, I think people kind of will start to talk about, I need to do this or I need to do that, or I'm excited that my city or my town is doing these different things. things in order to make things better or frankly, to make a buck.
I am encouraged because I think the issue of adaptation is that once the public kind of figures out what's going on, it's an issue to rally around more so than I think the climate change mitigation side, which is, the carbon emission side of it. It's like we're adapting, we're all kind of coming together. And so I hope once society really kind of picks it up that it's something to rally around versus like, okay, we need to change our light bulb or we need to drive a more fuel efficient car. But it's this rallying point. And so I don't know if that's sort of a naive hope, but I'm hoping over the next 5, 10, 20 years that adaptation is something the public is more likely to rally around.
No, I think that's very true. Maybe not necessarily more than mitigation, but certainly as much as mitigation, in my opinion. Because I think both of them, thinking about how to reduce your carbon footprint or make money by reducing climate change or how to adapt to ongoing climate change, it's really about being creative and innovative, and that's really something that a lot of people identify with as being an attribute of being an American, right? Is like, we go out and we do things and we come up with novel things and we do, we do great things. We find solutions to problems. That's really something that people feel defines us as a society, and it's kind of nice to think about that today on July 4th. And so absolutely, thinking about how to make your world better in response to ongoing climate change is very much of an opportunity for innovation and leadership and making the world a better place. So I'm hopeful like you are, Doug. I think people are going to start doing and talking and acting along these lines quite a bit more than they have been yet so far.
Well, adaptation, next thing you know, there's going to be a movie about it. I was very encouraged to see that this week. I haven't seen it yet, but HBO just came out with this documentary, How to Let Go of the World and Love All the Things Climate Can't Change. And so is my understanding, and from the pieces that I've seen, there is more of an emphasis on the adaptation side than it just being that purely mitigation or climate change impact kind of movie. And this podcast, this is the premier podcast of America Adapts. We're talking about adaptation, and so maybe there's a broader pivot going on about having this conversation about adaptation.
And I think you picked a nice title for this podcast, right? America Adapts, because it is. It's America. We're doing it.
We are on day one of a multi-day journey. Now, we're not going to chat much here. I'm hoping to have a longer conversation with you in the future, but anything kind of catch your eye in the last week or two on climate change, or are there any great websites you would recommend to listeners that for whatever reason? I know you do these short videos with the National Park Service. I don't know if you want to kind of share where people can find those or what those are all about.
Yeah, I haven't made any in a little bit, but they're good, and they're more about the science of climate change, but they're really good for giving you some background on what climate change is, how it's happening, and how it's affecting these places that we all love so much. Probably the best place to find them is just go to nps.gov/climate change, so that's nationalparkservice.gov/climate change, and you'll see them in the photos and multimedia section of that website. You could also look up National Park Service climate change on YouTube, and you'll find them there. In terms of websites, for adaptation, there's really nothing that beats CAKE or CAKEX. .org. Yep. CAKE stands for Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange. It's a really nice site that talks about adaptation case studies and what is going on with adaptation and how people are doing it. Put together by an organization called EcoAdapt. I recommend that pretty highly for your listeners.
Okay, I agree. I go there frequently. EcoAdapt has been doing some really exciting work on adaptations. Tim, I don't know if you had any requests for a future podcast guest. Who would you recommend that I try to get?
Oh, wow.
Anyone. Come on. Just challenge me. I'm going to go for it, Leonardo DiCaprio, Al Gore. Let's try something big here.
Well, you got me, so that's okay. You know what you should do is you should get Hillary Clinton.
Oh, okay. All right. Before she becomes president.
Might be a little bit easier, yeah. I think when if she becomes president, she'll have a bit more on her mind to deal with.
Wait, I've got to brainstorm. How about I host a debate between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump and talk about not just climate change, but climate change adaptation, because I'm sure both candidates have a lot to say about the issue.
There you go. I will listen in carefully to that.
All right, that would do wonders for viewership. Okay, I get it. It's a great idea. Well, thank you, Tim, for joining me today, and we will be back next time on America Adapts.